I'm pleased to be here today with business leader, mentor, and venture capitalist Mike Smerklo, who is going to discuss his broad range of experiences and his mistakes, as well as his lessons learned, as he's worked with entrepreneurs and leaders in the business community, which helped him create a formula called the SHAPE formula, or the SHAPE model for building mental toughness, which he shares in his very successful book, Mr. Monkey and Me, a real survival guide for entrepreneurs. So Mike, welcome, and I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Well, before we go too far into the conversation, it would be great if you would explain to everybody who Mr. Monkey is.
Well, actually, I brought him along, David. He's here, so I might have throw that mask on for a second. You know, it's really interesting. I struggled so much as an entrepreneur, and still even to this day, with the mental models in my head. And for me, it manifests itself as fear, uncertainty, and doubt, imposter syndrome. And when I was an entrepreneur, I would have these voices in my head. Oh, that was a dumb decision. Don't say that. You're going to screw this up. And I found over time, I was never able to master the voice, but I thought by personifying it. And for me, I made it a big, hairy, aggressive male monkey. It can be it's gender neutral and it doesn't have to be a monkey, but it was a voice inside my head that was really trying to candidly disrupt all of my plans and dreams. And so for me, being able to personify it as a Mr. Monkey, it at least helped me address it. And in the book, he's actually really the star of the book, not certainly my own career, but that's what I tried to do, is personify this beast of voice inside my head.
What I loved when I read the book was that nagging voice that was always in my head, that self-doubt, my fears in the middle of the night that would wake me up about problems the next day. They were just feelings until you put that term, Mr. Monkey. And once you put that name on in the book, and as you go through the book, I thought it was really interesting to actually take it out of just a feeling into something you could focus. I thought it was a really effective device you used. What made you think about using that? What was it that drove you to take that approach?
Well, I think, first of all, at first, I probably still think I'm crazy, but I kind of thought, man, am I the only one that has this voice in my head? When I looked around at other entrepreneurs, no one really talked about it. So I think that was the first point of it. But for me, I just found it over time, it started to become, well, first of all, I thought at some point it would go away. I thought certain levels of achievement, financial success, or what have you, acclamation would silence the voice. And I found that over time, as I got older, the voice kept getting stronger, more crafty, and still trying to disrupt me. And then it turns out, the more I talk to now my day job at Next Coast Ventures, I think that just about every business leader, entrepreneur, maybe every human has some form of this voice in their head. And so for me, again, putting a name to it at least helped me invite the beast in for a conversation. And I talk about in the book, but just really starting to say, okay, what is the voice saying? Is there something I can learn from the voice and something that I can apply? Maybe it's a good part of advice. And then also things that are just maybe stories from when I was 8 or 12 or 22 that are still playing in my head and really don't have a place in my life. That's what I really tried to embody in Mr. Monkey.
Interesting. So why do you think that resilience and understanding how to deal with Mr. Monkey and mental health and stress challenges is so important for leaders, especially in the environment we're at today? Why was this a call for you?
Well, I think I think everyone does have the voice. I think the acknowledgement of the voice is really the first step towards building the mental toughness that can allow all of us to be better leaders. I think we're in an environment where, candidly, it might be the toughest time to be an entrepreneur or a leader with all the things that are going on in the world. I think the temptations to misbehave have never been greater. And we've seen some really unfortunate examples of that with the bro culture or other aspects that have come out in some of the Silicon Valley stuff, but also in leaders. And so I certainly don't prescribe that I know all the answers or that I'm perfect, but I think the more that leaders and entrepreneurs can start to acknowledge this voice, become self-aware about it, I think that's the foundational aspect to really starting to develop some of the tools that can help you be a better leader, better entrepreneur, and maybe a better person.
Well, and it's interesting you say that because, I know you've been through different levels of organization, whether you started as an auditor, you became part of a startup, you've run your own business as a CEO, even took it public, and then as a venture capitalist. Can you talk a little bit about the differences that you've seen in these roles in terms of the internal and external expectations, and how maybe even the voice has changed, or how you see the, dealing with the voice at those levels?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. I think, part of it's also just maturity. Early on in my career, my first job was a CPA, and I joke it was one of those jobs I walked in, and about 12 hours in, I thought, what have I done? This can't be my calling in life. And then I did some investment banking work, which I learned a lot, but kind of sucked the life out of me. It just had no soul or no passion or no purpose, which was really what I was all about. So I think early on, the voice and the aspiration was really just to try and get ahead, get educated, work hard to achieve some level of anything. Candidly, from where I came was very modest beginnings. I think it was only when I became an entrepreneur, I went to work for a guy named Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, two legendary Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. I really saw what the world was all about entrepreneurship. And that opened my eyes to the possibility. And when I finally did it myself, the reason I did it was never for financial. I really wanted to go out and build something of meaning. I wanted to have a company where my employees loved to come to work, where we felt good about the service we were providing, and that we could have customers that loved what we did. That was kind of our mission. And early on, I think my voice as an entrepreneur, I felt a little bit scared to talk about those things. And it's only when I began to address the monkey and understand that voice that my authentic leadership began to come out. And I was able to get passion, a level of passion and energy that then was contagious. And I think that really helped propel the business forward.
It's really, really interesting you say that about that last piece there, because I wonder, I think a lot of people believe that once you get to a certain level, the voice goes away, or you own the voice. And my experience, I don't know about yours, but it doesn't matter where I am, there's always the voice there. But I think learning how to manage it and take control of it, for me, I found has been interesting. What about you? Do you think the voice goes away, or do you think you get better at managing Mr. Monkey as you get older?
Yeah, no, David, he was actually right here before we started this Fireside Chat. He was jumping around in my office, and he said, what do you have to say? No one's going to really listen to you. Are you prepared? David's going to ask great questions. It's all that stuff. So it doesn't go away. I do think that hopefully as I've gotten older, and I try and put some in the book, some very specific tactics to help address it. I think I've gotten better at least recognizing the voice and hearing it for what it is and what it isn't. And I think the harder thing is for any leader, as you get older, there's still, I still have my high school basketball coach screaming in my head from how many years ago when there was dinosaurs walking the earth. But there's still voices that you're going to carry from different parts of your life that may have no relevance. And so I think the more I get back to this, putting it in some sort of character has allowed me to understand, hey, that's 30-year-old voice. That doesn't have anything to do with what I'm addressing or trying to do with my life now. But now, I don't know, maybe someday, but it hadn't gone away yet.
Well, and I asked you that leading question because I kind of assumed that's where you're going to go. But I asked the leading question because not only did you put, kind of an image to the voice in your head, which I thought was great, but then you created this formula for actually helping manage those doubts, the shape formula. And I talked about, what I called Mr. Monkey. What you did, what you created, was you put a name behind self-doubt and self-sabotaging. Whether you're a leader, you have it, or whether you're managing people that have it. Understanding what to describe it and how to describe it is one thing. But the really powerful thing I think about your book and what you've done is the shape formula. Can you kind of give an overview, and then we can dive into what the shape formula is?
Yeah, sure. And what I want to try to do is just stepping back is again, getting to everyone has this voice. So how do you address it? And then how do you make a relatively generic formula? And watching what I learned from, again, Mark and Ben, when I was learning to be an entrepreneur, my own experiences, 12 years running a business, and now at Next Coast, where we've invested in $250 million over 50 companies. I've just watched these patterns over entrepreneurs. And what I started to see was really good entrepreneurs do part of the shape or most of the shape formula, and those are business leaders who struggle tend to miss it. And so the shape formula stands for: S is for self-awareness, H is for help, A is for authenticity, P is for persistence, and E is for expectations. And it's not exactly like Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you have to build upon it, but I do tend to think it works that way across learning and bringing these skills into your life.
I think that's great. I think, part of what the goal of Culturati is to provide some tools and really meaningful ways of looking at things, whether, their mental health or diversity, educate, a DEI, any of those things. And I think SHAPE actually does that. I think SHAPE gives you a framework with which to dealing with the self-doubt and self-sabotage. So let's start on the first one, self. How do you suggest people become more self-aware? How do they find those blind spots or things that they may not recognize in themselves that are leading to those problems?
Well, I think it starts with a self-inventory first and foremost, and acknowledging we're all good at things and we're bad at things. And I joke, it's like, what are you really good at? Not what your mom says you're good at, but what are you really good at, and what are you not so good at, and what are the unique attributes that you have? I think the more you can start. I did this when I was 22 years old. I'll tell you a little story. I'm very fortunate. I grew up in the mid 70s. I'm a tall white guy, so I still started on second base, but I came from a very impoverished background. A lot of divorce and disease and addiction in my family. So a lot of my voice was that. I call it the Toledo, Ohio voice. You're never going to be successful. And my grandma used to say to anyone with means, hey, it must be nice, right? So that was kind of my pre-college. And then I finally started taking inventory of myself in late college and just say, okay, I do have some skills. What are they good? What am I uniquely qualified to do? And where are areas I need to develop? And I still do this today, but the foundational aspect, what I find that does is to say, here's where I'm good and here's the strengths, and I'm going to play to my strengths. Because we all know, at least for me, it's a lot harder to change my weaknesses than play to my strengths. And then where are gaps that I'm not so good at, and I either need to develop those skills or get some help around it. But I think the biggest thing is self-inventory, getting feedback from others, and taking an honest look at your own attributes, to me, is the first step in really starting to develop some of the mental toughness, and then leads to the rest of the formula.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's almost kind of the net promoter score for your personal self, right? Do what you do better, and anything that's bad, try to at least get it to neutral.
Well,
so it's not causing problems.
I've been happily married for 16 years, and I always joke, it's like, you can either try and change your spouse or appreciate his or her weaknesses or strengths. I don't know. I'm not a marriage counselor, but whenever I try and do the former, it doesn't work, and the latter seems to work well for me. So I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's 35 years for me this year. So I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. So you also talk a lot in the book about health and the value of mentors and coaches, which I thought was really interesting. And I loved how you talked about, some of the pros. So I'll let you tell that story of the guidance you got from one of your first mentors. But how do you go about finding the right mentor, and how do you know if the mentor is adding value or not?
Yeah, it's a super question. I mean, one thing I'm a huge fan of. I think there's mentors all around us, right? And they don't have to be direct. I see so many leaders or entrepreneurs that try and go get some big name mentor and say, that person, look what they did before, and they're going to help me. For me, mentorship and help in general comes from someone who's understands and has firsthand experience of what you're doing. Secondly, has done it recently. So if you're a first-time CEO or first-time CFO, it doesn't really matter. Going to get a 30-year veteran might be helpful, but going to find someone who just became a CFO 5 years ago might be really a better source. So I tend to think do they have domain experience? Are they somewhat recent in their advice? And then third, are they willing to spend the time? I think if you get those three formula or attributes right, you can have a really powerful group of mentors or coaches. And I do think it changes over time. The other thing I found out, I tell the story in the book about getting help from a guy named Bill Campbell, who was just a Silicon Valley legend. There's a book called $1 Trillion Coach. He had been the coach to founders of Google, Twitter, Steve Jobs, et cetera. And I was lucky to have a relationship with him. But we were one time sitting in a bar in Palo Alto called the Old Pro. I was exhausted, bags under my eyes, had fired 3 head of sales, couldn't figure out the formula. And he just looked at me and said, Steve Jobs has a coach. Tiger Woods has a coach. Why the heck wouldn't Mike Smerklo have a coach? And then it was one of those aha moments where it helped me, one, realize that I don't have to have all the answers, but two, asking for help and expressing vulnerability around where your needs are can be one of the most powerful things you do as a leader.
Yeah, and Bill Campbell's one of those interesting people. I think he was so key to the early days of Silicon Valley. So I started one of the first Windows PC company, Windows
Yeah.
pen companies, and his history. He was really the true pioneer in pen computing.
Yeah.
Way back in the '80s. So Bill Campbell's a legend in Silicon Valley, and how important do you think it is to find mentors beyond just what you do for work? Beyond your discipline specialty.
It's a great question, David. I've been obsessed. I just finished this book. It's a couple years old by Brian Glazer called Curiosity. And just as a side note, he talks about these curiosity conversations that he's done throughout his life. And without going too much in the book, what he basically found was the more he got out of his circle, he's a famous Hollywood producer, but the more he got out of his circle and got curious around other disciplines and leadership styles and life experiences, the better he became at his job. And so to your point, I think, yes, you want to, if you're learning to become a head of sales, you probably want to have a mentor that's directly related to that. But I think help and mentorships all around you. So a curious mindset, what makes a great head of sales? What areas do I need to develop? Where do I learn to develop whatever XYZ skill is? I think it can be all around you. And it comes from that curious mindset and candidly ties back to self-awareness.
Well, and one of the things that we really want to talk about with this whole area of mental health is mental toughness. And I think a lot of people think that mentorship is only about helping you in your career path. But can you talk about how mentors can help deal with stress periods, or how can they help you develop your mental acuity as you're dealing with a lot of pressure, especially in days like today, we're dealing with this stuff.
Well, and I think we all could agree that what we really need right now is human connectivity and the ability to communicate and understand and empathize, which seems to have gotten dramatically lost over the last couple of years. So I personally believe, whether it just be leader or just trying to be a better person, it gets back to that authenticity and vulnerability. And something that I really stunk at earlier in my career. I was not good at it and probably still not great at it, but just expressing a vulnerability and saying, I don't know the answer, or I don't understand your point of view, or I don't agree with you, and I'm curious as to why I don't agree with you. That framework, to me, gosh, if we could get that throughout our society, think of what more expansive opportunities we would have to learn and understand.
Mm-hmm.
I love what the D&I initiatives are doing, but to me, there's a whole nother level down to say, why is this still an issue with our society? What are we missing? How can we get curious about inclusion? And the more we do that, then I think it creates empathy. Then I think it creates understanding and learning, and then growth. So yeah, there's a lot there. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do think the vulnerability aspect to me is one of the greatest superpowers that a leader can have.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too how you said that, because I think that that you could do a whole session just on mentoring and just on how to work effectively with your mentors, how to get help and how to give help back.
Yeah.
But you talked about authenticity, and I really wanted to go into that because I know that's the A part of the shape. And the question I would have on the authenticity is, what do you really mean by that? And can you talk about how you see authenticity really shown in leaders? How do leaders show authenticity?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I mean, a little bit of story. I struggled with this one, and I think of all the monkey voices in my head, authenticity, I had these frameworks of what I thought a leader or an entrepreneur did. And I talk about two different mentors I had. I had a gentleman named Greg Reyes, another Silicon Valley legend back in the real go-go days in the 90s, kind of a Greek tragedy, at one point a billionaire, then went to prison. He was just on Clubhouse with Ben and Mark talking about this. So really interesting, but kind of George Clooney meets NFL linebacker, CEO, just the epitome of super strong, show no weakness guy. And then I go work for Ben Horowitz, who's 180 of that. Ben never got caught up in the CEO power position, really was a soft-spoken, kind of introverted leader, but very direct in his communication. And I tell that story because when I first became an entrepreneur, I would just go back and forth between these two. Like, should I act like Greg? Should I act like Ben? And what I found was it was both exhausting and inefficient and ineffective, all three, because I was trying to, and at times help me learn to be a leader, but I wasn't showing up as Mike.
Mhm.
And so it really took for me to start to feel that exhaustion, but also feel something lacking in how I was communicating with my team members, with my employees, and those around me. And it kind of led back to a situation where I was in a staff meeting. We had a tough decision to make. I just blurted out, I don't know. Mr. Monkey comes running into, in my head, like, what did you just say? What do you mean you just don't know? And I just finally figured out that I wanted to be more open. I wanted to disclose where I was struggling. I didn't want to pretend I had all the answers, and I wanted to be myself. And I struggled with it. I still do. I mean, it's just something I've always struggled with. But I think the more I do that, and the more I just became Mike in what I believed and was able to communicate that, the more, again, empowered me as a leader. I do think, though, and you and I talked a little bit of this, I do think a lot of people use authentic can use that as a crutch to be a disrespectful person or show up in inefficient or impolite ways. That's not what I mean by authenticity. Being a jerk is not authentic in my mind. Very different.
Well, and when I read your section on this, what really hit me, and I really love your feedback, is what I look for in authenticity is is this an I leader or a we leader?
Yeah.
And you can kind of tell that with the authenticity. I think that was the jerk piece that you just talked about. I think that if you're really a we leader and you're authentic and people believe that, then you can say some really direct and what could be perceived as harsh without it being perceived as being jerky. And I loved your thoughts on this I versus we and authenticism.
It's so great, David. I love that term. And we see it every day at Next Coast you see efficient leaders, and almost all of them are we leaders, right? And that was Ben Horowitz, what you just described. And Ben would say things in meetings that made me and everyone else cringe, but he never did it from a place of he wasn't trying to be mean or petty. You knew he always had the organization's best interest in mind. And to me, that's the biggest difference on a we leader. It doesn't mean you have to be always upbeat, but if you have the whole organization in mind, to your point, and bring that to the forefront, then candid and direct feedback is a good thing, right? But don't let that become your go-to for everything.
Right. No, I think that's excellent. I think that authenticity piece is so important. How much do you think authenticity is important for your own personal, quieting Mr. Monkey or, dealing with the self-doubt? How much does it play in your personal mental health, do you think?
I think it's huge. I really do. I think, and I talk about some tools that I've used. I've learned to meditate over the last few years. I wish I would have done it as a leader. And I think everyone who worked for me, listen, I was a jerk. I mean, I admit it. I was a driven, I'm not sure I was a we leader, but I was very driven, and I've learned from that. But I do think whenever I'm really feeling stressed or not sleeping well or something's nagging at me, I would argue that most of the time it's because I'm out of authenticity in one of my relationships. It could be personal, it could be professional. But am I communicating my feelings? Am I doing it in a normalized way? I'm not reducing myself to anger or temper tantrums. Am I doing it in a very balanced way? And when I do that, I find myself, the voice tends to go away. And when I move off of that, yeah, he's screaming and yelling at me.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned when I was I didn't learn this lesson until I became CEO. And I realized that what I did really affected the organization in both positive and negative way, was that I thought authentic was putting those emotions out there all the time and just being totally transparent. And what I realized was that as a CEO, I needed to be amplifying good news and minimizing bad news. I wasn't hiding it. I couldn't hide bad news, but I had to not be as emotional about it, because if I was emotional, everybody would get upset. So it's still trying to be authentic, but it was learning how to govern those emotions. And like, if I downplayed some good news, then people didn't think it was that big of a deal. Yeah. And that was probably one of the kind of the interesting things as I read your book. I went through and go, oh, wait, there's a governor to authenticity and emotion.
There is, especially the emotion. I think it's one of the hardest things. And I'm so passionate about entrepreneurship, but I always want people to come in with the right framework. And I don't think it's just entrepreneurship, but leaders. But yeah, the biggest thing that I've discovered early on is you have a bad morning and you come into the office and you're not showing up as your best self. It cascades throughout the organization much faster than you realize. And so I think authenticity doesn't mean, hey, I'm in a bad mood and everyone's going to feel it. It's just the opposite of that. And I do think leadership is stepping back and recognizing I have a different level of responsibility. And to your point, I remember walking in one time and making some side comment about some wall color. Why is that wall color blue? Right. Passing through one of our offices. And then a week later, I've got a proposal to repaint the office. And like, what are you talking about? Like, well, you said you didn't, we heard, and all of a sudden, like, oh, great reminder, don't be a bull in the china shop. It's really, really destructive on multiple levels.
Right. That's excellent. It's a great example. Well, I want to make sure we get to the P&E because this is a really important model. I don't want to just stop there. Let's talk about persistence. And because I know it's a major component of your framework and it's something you spend time on. But you describe persistence as more than just stick-with-itness. Can you talk about persistence and what you see as persistence in a leader, what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think so. For me, persistence just means understand that there is going to be ups and downs. And for me, also, it's not just stick-to-itiveness, it's a great differentiation. I think that anyone who joins into any business endeavor, and it can be leader, can be entrepreneur, whatever your path is, I always thought for some, again, childhood fantasy that there would be some perfect day, for example, that someday would come and everything would be great. And what I figured out early enough on was there's always going to be ups and downs. So back to your emotional balance and mental tenacity, there's always going to be ups and downs. If you get way high on the ups and way low on the lows, it's going to be a really, really detrimental journey. So part of persistence is just understanding that it is the cliche-ish marathon, not a sprint. But the other part was learning to take the setbacks that are going to come anytime you're trying to do something great, any goal that you have, there's going to be setbacks. And I think part of the leadership and the authenticity and the mental tenacity, on the mental toughness, comes from just understanding that and appreciating it versus hoping or praying or fighting against, to your point, any bad news. I think that persistent mindset is really incredibly important. And I also think it helps people, not only when you're being successful, helps people from staying in balance when things are going really well too. Understanding that this is a pretty big wave or pretty big roller coaster. So riding that with a balanced framework is all about persistence in my mind.
So when I read this, my takeaway was, and I'd love to get your feedback, whether I was off or on, was I saw persistence as also consistency. Yeah. Whether you're being consistent with your direction and the way you work with your investors as a as an entrepreneur and your employees and your stakeholders, or as a leader being consistent and persistent with what you're trying to do with your employees and your team, that consistency / persistence. Did I read your section
Absolutely.
Correctly?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, hey, set a big vision. Because that's like, I had this old saying in my thing that was like, make no small plans because they don't have the ability to move a man's soul. So I'm a big believer in setting really big goals, but then understanding you have to break them down into medium-sized goals, weekly, and then daily, and then you got to get out of bed and go do it. So I think the persistent mindset, and really ties into what you just said, is how do I set a really big goal, but then how do I break it down? Then how do I get up every day and do the work? And that's also part of I think sometimes, certainly on entrepreneurship, there's this mythology that you come up with a great idea, you go on Shark Tank, you get $1 million check, and then you ride off to your yacht or island. Mm-hmm. You know better than anybody. That's 180 degrees from the truth. So understanding from day one, it's going to be a long journey. There's going to be ups and downs, but having the persistent mindset to get through it all. And to your point, setting consistent goals, how you show up as a leader, that's really the persistent mindset embodied.
Well, and I think when you're talking about startups and entrepreneurship, pivoting has become such an important part of what happens with startups, right? So how do you stay persistent and convince the organization that you're still staying with your big vision as you're having to make these pivots along the way? I thought was
it's so hard. I also think, it's so funny because pivots are such an interesting side. We could spend, a whole nother hour on that, which I don't want to, but I do think that feedback is so important. And it's like, some point when you've got an idea, you got to have this stick-to-itiveness. But if 100 investors tell you that the idea is not going to work, maybe you keep after it because there is that you need the 101, but starting to learn and listen to that feedback. Okay, what did all 100 tell me? And then maybe modifying accordingly. I think that's also it's a tricky slope.
So what you're saying is persistence does not mean blind stubbornness.
Exactly. Exactly.
Great. Well, so and I think the last big part of the model or the framework, the formula, is this expectations. You talk about it as the final component. I'm a big fan of backcasting, thinking about what the future is going to be and looking back and working your way forward, which is what you just kind of described about your big view. But you add this interesting dimension in the book about thinking your expectations about what's really going to make you happy, which I thought was brilliant, and your 100% rule related to expectations. Can you talk about all of this, your view on expectations and happiness, how it all kind of gels together?
Yeah, it ties back to the voice again. But first of all, I think that understanding, certainly with entrepreneurship and all leadership, it's like there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end, right? Everything else, every movie has the same thing. And so I try to at least lay out to say in the beginning, having the right expectations, knowing it's going to be hard, taking the first step. In the middle, knowing that there is no perfect day. I used to have these dreams that when we got to 50 million in revenue, everything would get easy. Turns out when we got to 50 million in revenue, I just had a whole bunch of different problems that I had to address. So there's that expectation. And then the end is what is going to make you happy. I talk about in the book, I mean, I openly say I got fired from my job. It was a graceful removal of my position. And in retrospect, I had lost all of the true north that I had driven for as an entrepreneur. I talked about earlier, build a great company, having employees love to come to work. Candidly, I lost sight of it. I got exhausted. I got burnout. I got entitled. And when I got removed by a dear mentor of mine, I knew it was the right time. And so just having expectations around how these things are going to change. And then last but not least, understanding that, at least for me, really focusing on what is going to make the biggest difference in your life, what's going to make you happy, and understanding that financial goals are interesting, but holistically looking at your life, business and leadership is one part of it, but there's so much more out there, and making sure you have all that and you're in the embroidery of your life.
That's terrific. Yeah, I thought that was a very powerful piece. And this idea of really making sure you're thinking about what drives true happiness, not just what the goal is, but what are you going to get out of it? So since this session is part of the mental health track, and many of the participants may not be founders or CEOs, can you discuss the applicability of the lessons from your book and from the SHAPE formula to those just trying to work up the management ladder or be successful? Why should they be thinking about Mr. Monkey and this approach?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think he or she or it is your greatest enemy or your greatest strength. So anyone in life, it's that. Listen, if I can achieve what I've achieved, I joke it's like anybody can do it. But I do mean sincerely, like this voice can either be a detriment to your life, or it can help you figure out where you need to improve and get forward. And that's why I wrote the book, was really trying to inspire people to get thoughtful about the inner voice, inner critic, regardless of what your role in life is. And I do think even if you're not an entrepreneur and you're thinking about business leadership or general leadership, I struggle to imagine a great leader that doesn't have the attributes of the formula. Self-awareness, getting help, authenticity, persistent expectations. I do think those apply to just about any walk of life. I wrote the book more around the entrepreneurial angle, but I hope that anyone could read it and say, yes, this has applicability to just about anything.
That's excellent. Well, thanks, Mike. As we wrap up, are there any things that you want to kind of add? Did I leave any questions like, I wish David asked that question?
Well, I will make my one shameless plug for the book is that all proceeds go to charity. We set up a scholarship, my wife and I, for students who are from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds. So if anybody's out there thinking about buying the book, know that the proceeds all go to, we think, a very worthy cause. Because I do believe, my closing statement, the world needs more innovation. And I think that mostly comes from entrepreneurship. I think we need more diversity. I know we need more diversity in leadership and entrepreneurship, and we need more mentally strong leaders and entrepreneurs. So hopefully I'm contributing in some small way to that.
Well, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you doing this and the gift of the book. I think it's an excellent tool. I thank you for giving the name to the voice in my head. And the framework is really an excellent way to try to think about the challenges. So thank you so much for the book and for doing this today.
Thanks, David. It was a pleasure. And I really appreciate the kind words and the great questions.
Thanks.